Welcome to this episode of 214 Square, produced on Friday, October 24th, and aired on Monday, October 27th, 2025. Today, less than 2 weeks away from Election Day, we'll look at the newest numbers from New York City and then, of course, at the numbers from New Jersey. We will then dive into the voter demographics of Virginia, and our last points are the government shutdown, the president's job approval, and the top issues of voters nationwide. Candidates Mamdani, Sliwa, and Cuomo battled each other in the final debate before the election. Observers agree that Mamdani won the debate. Mayor Eric Adams, who dropped out recently, has endorsed third candidate and former Governor Cuomo. In the newest polls, we see Mamdani now again below the majority with 48%, while Sliwa improved by 3 points, now at 17, and Cuomo is at 29%. When we look at the development of the polls, we see a first significant loss for Democratic candidate Mamdani. The biggest surprise might be Republican Sliwa, who gained 10% since mid-September. This, however, should not endanger Mamdani's victory, as he is ahead of Cuomo by 19%. Even the prediction market Polymarket sees Mamdani as the likeliest winner of this election. In New Jersey, Democratic contender Sherrill is, according to the polls, ahead of her Republican challenger Ciattarelli, who is trailing her by 5%. Our unweighted chart shows a zigzag movement of Mrs. Sherrill, while Mr. Ciattarelli's curve is steadily going up. Our weighted chart, however, shows that Mikie Sherrill has a mostly positive development except for week 39. Jack Ciattarelli is relatively stable and slightly upward. If we look at Polymarket again, we see that the prediction market sees Sherrill as the likeliest winner. Now, as we move to Virginia, we want to further understand the Commonwealth's voters. Here we use data from the Virginia Health Department and 2017 election data that was available. In our first chart, we see the share of white females and white males in the total population of a county and how the county voted, with values in the negative representing the Republican candidate and a positive value representing the Democratic candidate. We see that the majority of dots for both groups lean toward the Republican Party the more white females and males are represented in the county's population. In comparison, here we see female and male black voters. The higher the share of the black population in a county or city, the more the dots lean toward the Democratic Party. We could also say that there's a correlation between the share of black voters in a county and the tendency to vote Democratic. It looks slightly different when we look at Hispanic voters. They seem to be more balanced and show a less strong tendency toward voting Democratic when there's a larger share of Hispanics in the population. However, we see that more female Hispanics tend to live in Democratic voting counties than male Hispanics. And there is a similar development if we look at this scatter plot for female and male Asians and Pacific Islanders in Virginia. Also here, though slightly, women in this demographic group tend to live in Democratic voting counties the higher their share of the total population is. All groups but whites have in common that they tend to live in Republican voting counties the lower their total share is. With the amount of white population rising in a county, the more likely this specific population group can be found in a Republican-leaning county. Some more voter demographics show that education levels can influence whom a white voter is voting for. Around 3/4 of white voters without a college degree voted for a Republican candidate, while half of white voters with a college degree voted Democratic. But the education of non-whites doesn't make a difference. Here, the Democrats are dominating with a bit more than 3/4. The differences among white voters are bigger when we look at gender. Around half of white women with a college degree voted for a Democratic candidate, but only 2/5 of white men with a degree. Even without an academic degree, a fourth of white women voted Democratic, while their male equivalent voted Democratic only about a fifth of the time. If you are a white evangelical or born-again Christian, you are very likely to vote Republican. 6 in 7 vote Republican. Lastly, we again focus on the 8 counties and cities in Virginia, which are the best candidates for swinging between the parties. We look specifically at how the voters there voted in the last 2 gubernatorial elections 4 and 8 years ago. We first look at the racial and ethnic composition of the counties and cities. In the first 4, we see that the share of white voters is decreasing, while those of Hispanics and blacks are increasing. However, we're talking about the share of the total population. The remaining 4 show a different trend. Lynchburg and Prince Edward County show a relatively stable white population, with even an increasing one in Surry County. Noticeable is the lower share of black voters in Stafford, but a high share of Hispanics, Asians, and biracial individuals. Stafford, Surry, and Prince Edward are also noticeable when we look at the gender balance. We already know that women have a higher tendency to vote Democratic. Prince Edward and Surry had a population with more women than men. This, however, changed. Now the population consists of more men. In the last step, we look at how our 8 counties and cities differ from the entirety of Virginia. To do this, we first must weight the values. We can't just take the average due to different population numbers. The share of white voters would be almost 70%, but after weighting, the real share is 59%. We do the same for Hispanic and black voters and for the share of women in the total population. And we see that our 8 counties and cities have around 2% fewer whites, more blacks, roughly a fourth rather than a fifth. The difference between the number of Hispanics and women differs slightly. In the current polls, Spanberger is ahead with 7% over Lieutenant Governor Earle-Sears. In an unweighted chart, we see a zigzag movement like in New Jersey. That's why we weighted the movements again and looked at the trend week by week. There we see a relatively stable distance of 5 points between Spanberger and Earle-Sears. With most polls having a margin of error of 3 to 4%, we see that Earle-Sears still has a realistic, though lower, chance. But again, on Polymarket, we see that on this prediction market, Abigail Spanberger is the likeliest winner, so Virginia would have a Democratic governor again. America is still in a shutdown, and if the parties don't find a compromise by Monday, the shutdown will last for 27 days, 1 week away from breaking the record of 34 days from 2018 to 19 during President Trump's first term. It is already the second longest shutdown, which until now happened during President Clinton's first term. Apart from a shutdown under President Obama, you can see that President Carter had to handle multiple shutdowns, among others because Congress couldn't find a solution on the funding of abortions through America's healthcare system. The newest poll from YouGov shows that fewer likely voters blame one side alone. Instead, more now blame both parties, over 25% compared to almost 22% last week. On Polymarket, there is currently a 40% likelihood for the shutdown to be lifted by November 19th this year. Looking at the president's net approval rating, we see a drop of 4 points to -10. Nationally, we look at the top issues this year. We took data from 3 YouGov polls this month. The most important issue for Americans today is prices and the inflation rate. This should remain important after the CPI values were published on Friday, October 24th, with annual inflation climbing above 3% again. Other issues are jobs and the economy, healthcare, and immigration. Throughout the month, the 2 top issues gained more importance, while immigration and healthcare dropped slightly. Also gaining importance were government spending and taxes, climate change, abortion, and foreign policy. When we compare the top issues and their differences by gender, we see that more women than men see inflation as a top issue, and healthcare is also more important to them than to men. For men, jobs and the economy as well as immigration are more important issues. Men currently care more about taxes and government spending, while civil rights have a higher priority for women. This matters insofar as a bit more than 50% of America's 338 million inhabitants are women. While prices matter to white and black voters equally, more black voters name jobs and the economy as well as civil rights as important issues, while white voters see immigration and civil liberties as more important. Of America's population, around 57% are white, 20% are Hispanics, around 12% are black, and around 7% are Asians and or Pacific Islanders. Looking at age groups, voters between 45 and 64 are more worried about inflation and immigration, while the group between 18 and 29 says that jobs, the economy, civil rights, economic protection, and education are their top issues. The group of those between 18 and 29 makes up almost 20% of the U.S. population. The group between 45 and 64 has the largest share of the population at 25%. The last comparison is between those who, in 2024, voted either for Kamala Harris or for Donald Trump. More Trump than Harris voters say their top issues are inflation, the economy, immigration, taxes, crime, national security, and guns. For Harris voters, the top issues are healthcare, civil rights and liberties, environmental protection, and education. In November 2024, 74 million Americans voted for then Vice President Kamala Harris, while 3 million more voted for Donald Trump, who had already served as president from 2017 to 2021. In the last episode before the election, we will forecast the results for all elections. That's it for today. Thank you for watching and stay tuned.